She smiled at everyone who walked through her door. A kind, soft-spoken landlady who cared for the elderly and the forgotten. But behind that warm welcome in a quiet Sacramento boarding house, people were disappearing one by one. No screams. No forced entries. No obvious signs of trouble. Just empty rooms, and a woman who always had the same calm answer. They moved out. Until one simple question changed everything. Where is Albert? And what investigators uncovered in her backyard would reveal a truth far darker than anyone could have imagined. The first clue didn't arrive with urgency or panic. It came quietly, in the form of a routine welfare check, one of those everyday investigations that rarely leads to anything serious. A social worker arrived at a worn but oddly well-kept boarding house in Sacramento, looking for an elderly tenant named Albert. He hadn't been seen for several days, and in places like this, that was enough reason for concern. The house itself gave off a strange contradiction. From the outside, it looked like it belonged to someone trying to do good in the world. Inside, it felt warm, almost comforting. The air smelled faintly of cooked food and cleaning powder, and everything seemed arranged with careful attention, as if disorder was unwelcome here. When the door opened, the woman standing there immediately put the visitor at ease. She was calm, composed, and softly spoken. Her name was Dorothea Puente. She listened without interruption, her expression gentle and understanding, as though missing tenants were a normal part of life in a place like this. "Oh, Albert," she said with a faint, reassuring smile. "He went to visit family. He'll be back soon." There was no hesitation in her voice. No visible tension. Just a simple explanation that seemed to close the matter before it could even begin. On the surface, it made sense. People came and went from boarding houses all the time. And Dorothea herself didn't look like someone who inspired doubt. She appeared patient, caring, even slightly concerned that someone would question her word. But something lingered in the back of the social worker's mind. Albert didn't have family. And that small inconsistency, barely noticeable at first, was the first crack in a story that would eventually unravel something far darker than anyone expected. To the outside world, Dorothea Puente was exactly the kind of person a neighborhood feels lucky to have. She didn't just run a boarding house, she seemed to offer something closer to refuge. Her home in Sacramento became a place where the forgotten could land, elderly men with no close relatives, disabled tenants with limited income, and people quietly slipping through the cracks of society. Neighbors saw what they wanted to see. A kind woman who cooked warm meals, kept her property reasonably tidy, and spoke politely to everyone she met. She often greeted people with a soft smile, never raising her voice, never drawing attention in a way that felt suspicious. If anything, she seemed overly generous for someone running such a modest home. Inside the boarding house, life appeared structured. Meals were served. Rent was collected. Rooms were assigned. Everything felt controlled but orderly, like a small system that worked efficiently under her care. For those who had nowhere else to go, Dorothea represented stability. But beneath that carefully maintained surface, something was quietly shifting. Tenants began to disappear. Not all at once. Not in a way that created immediate alarm. One would be seen regularly, then less frequently. Another would stop appearing in shared spaces altogether. A few simply stopped responding when their names were called. And each time someone asked, Dorothea had an answer ready, delivered with calm certainty. They moved out. They found better housing. They went to stay with family. There was never panic in her voice. No confusion. No inconsistency that stood out strongly enough to demand deeper investigation. Her explanations were simple, believable, and spoken with the kind of confidence that discourages further questions. And people accepted them. Because it was easier to trust her than to suspect her. She didn't fit the image of danger. She didn't behave like someone hiding anything. In fact, she seemed like the least likely person in the entire neighborhood to be involved in anything sinister. But that is what made her so effective. Her kindness wasn't just a trait, it was a shield. And behind that shield, residents who entered her home quietly vanished from sight, one by one, without raising immediate suspicion in the world outside. At the time, no one realized that absence itself was becoming the pattern. It didn't start with a breakthrough. There was no dramatic confession, no sudden burst of evidence, and no witness stepping forward with a shocking revelation. Instead, what began to shift the entire case was something far more ordinary, a follow-up visit that should have been routine. Investigators had returned to Dorothea Puente's boarding house to ask more questions about the missing tenants. On the surface, nothing had changed. The house still looked calm, almost domestic. The same quiet order. The same controlled atmosphere. Dorothea still greeted them with that steady, unbothered composure, as if their questions were mildly inconvenient but not threatening. She answered just as she always had. Clearly. Calmly. Without visible hesitation. Each missing person had a simple explanation. Each absence neatly placed into a category that required no further concern. But this time, the investigators did something different. They didn't leave. They stayed longer. They observed more closely. They began to compare her statements, looking for patterns instead of accepting individual answers. And slowly, the surface-level certainty she presented started to feel less solid. Small inconsistencies, timelines that didn't fully match, details that shifted slightly depending on the question, began to stand out when viewed together. Dorothea remained composed throughout. But something subtle changed. A pause. Not long. Not dramatic. Barely noticeable to someone not paying close attention. But it was there, just a fraction of hesitation when a question landed a little too close to something sensitive. A moment where her confidence didn't flow as smoothly as before. And that was enough. Because experienced investigators understand something important, people can prepare answers. They can rehearse stories. They can even maintain composure under pressure. But hesitation is different. It is not something easily controlled. It often appears when a person is calculating, adjusting, or trying to decide how much truth is safe to reveal. The decision was made quietly, without confrontation. They would take a closer look at the property. Dorothea agreed, but not immediately. There was a brief delay. A slight shift in expression that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. Then she stepped aside, allowing them access. And in that moment, the direction of the entire investigation changed. Because sometimes, it isn't what someone says that reveals them. It's what they don't want you to see when you stop listening. At first glance, the property still didn't look like anything out of the ordinary. It was an old boarding house, the kind of place where age showed in uneven flooring, weathered wood, and a yard that had seen better days. The garden area wasn't particularly well kept, but nothing about it immediately suggested danger. If anything, it looked like neglect, grass that hadn't been trimmed properly, soil that had been left uneven by time and weather. But investigators were no longer looking at the house the same way. They had stopped accepting surfaces at face value. As they stepped into the backyard, attention began to shift toward small details that didn't quite fit. Certain patches of ground looked different from others. Some areas appeared slightly disturbed, as though they had been recently dug up and carefully covered again. Nothing obvious, nothing dramatic, but enough to raise questions that could not be ignored. One of the officers paused. Then another. They didn't speak much at first. Instead, they observed, circled, compared. The yard didn't feel natural anymore. It felt managed in a way that was almost too deliberate, as if someone had tried to make sure nothing unusual stood out at a glance. And then came the decision that changed everything. They began to dig. It started slowly, in one small section of soil. There was no certainty yet, only suspicion, and the need to confirm or dismiss it. But as the layers of earth were carefully moved aside, the atmosphere shifted. The quiet of the yard became heavier, more focused. Every movement now carried weight. What they uncovered removed any remaining doubt about the seriousness of the investigation. There were remains buried beneath the surface. Then more were discovered as the search expanded. The backyard, which had once looked like a forgotten space behind an aging home, was no longer just part of the property. It had become the center of something far more disturbing than anyone had expected. Each discovery added another piece to a growing reality that was difficult to fully process in the moment. This was no longer about missing persons or unanswered questions. It was now about a pattern, one that had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. The boarding house was no longer simply a place where people disappeared from notice. It had become a place where their absence had been quietly concealed. And Dorothea Puente, who had stood at the door with calm confidence, was now no longer just a helpful landlady in an old neighborhood. She had become the focus of a case that was rapidly revealing its true scale. Once the backyard discoveries were confirmed, everything that once felt uncertain about Dorothea Puente's boarding house suddenly became part of a larger, undeniable pattern. The calm explanations she had given for each missing tenant were no longer just questionable, they were collapsing under the weight of physical evidence. What had once been accepted as simple disappearances now demanded a completely different interpretation. Investigators widened their search, moving carefully through the property and its records. The deeper they looked, the clearer the structure of her actions appeared. Dorothea wasn't acting randomly. There was a method behind the silence, a consistency behind the missing names that pointed to something organized rather than chaotic. Her victims were not chosen at random in a visible sense to outsiders. They were people who lived on the margins, individuals without close family connections, without strong social ties, and without anyone regularly checking on their well-being. In that absence of attention, Dorothea found opportunity. She offered what appeared to be safety. A room. A meal. A place to stay when no one else would provide one. And for people who had nowhere else to go, that offer was powerful enough to override hesitation. Trust was built slowly, quietly, through routine kindness and the appearance of stability. But once that trust was secured, the pattern shifted. Financial control became part of the structure. Benefits and payments tied to tenants began to move in ways that benefited her. And over time, those who entered her home stopped being seen outside of it. What made the case so unsettling wasn't just the outcome, it was how ordinary everything appeared on the surface while it was happening. There were no loud warnings. No public signs of danger. No obvious disruption that forced immediate action. Everything was hidden behind routine interactions and a carefully maintained image of care. Even Dorothea herself remained composed through much of the investigation. That calm expression, the gentle tone, the steady confidence, it was the same presence that had reassured visitors at her door. But now, it was no longer interpreted as kindness. It was viewed through a completely different lens. Because investigators had learned something important, control doesn't always look like force. Sometimes it looks like comfort. Sometimes it looks like trust being given willingly to someone who never appeared to deserve suspicion. And in Dorothea's case, that was exactly what made everything possible for so long. The smile she had once used to put people at ease had become the very thing that masked what was happening behind closed doors. But no system built on silence lasts forever. Eventually, even the quietest truth finds a way to surface. By the time the full investigation came together, Dorothea Puente's boarding house was no longer seen as a place of shelter. It had become the center of a disturbing criminal pattern that had remained hidden in plain sight. What once looked like a quiet, caring environment was now understood as a carefully controlled system where vulnerable people could disappear without immediate notice. As evidence mounted, the illusion Dorothea had maintained for years began to collapse. Her explanations, once accepted without challenge, could no longer stand against the physical findings in the backyard and the inconsistencies uncovered in her records. Each new detail added weight to a reality that was difficult to ignore. Multiple tenants had vanished under her care, and their absence was not accidental. The most unsettling part of the case was not just what was discovered, but how long it remained undiscovered. Everything had depended on trust, silence, and the assumption that appearances reflected truth. Dorothea had relied on that assumption, and for a long time, it worked. But eventually, small questions became larger investigations. And those investigations led to answers that could no longer be hidden. In the end, it wasn't a dramatic confession that exposed everything. It was persistence, attention to detail, and a single missing person that opened the first real crack in her story. And from that crack, the entire truth unfolded. The case of Dorothea Puente remains a reminder that danger does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides behind familiarity, routine, and a smile that feels too normal to question. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video. Subscribe for more true crime stories. Comment your thoughts below. What shocked you the most? Share this with others who love mystery and crime cases.